So you've watched season 1 of SAS Rogue Heroes, and now you want to know how much of what you saw actually happened. That's a fair question, because the series presents itself with enough real names, places, and events to feel authentic, while also leaning heavily into stylization, exaggeration, and modern storytelling choices. This video is not about dismissing the show outright or nitpicking every dramatic flourish, but about separating history from television. I'm going to work through some of the major inaccuracies and creative liberties, starting with how key characters are portrayed and which important figures are omitted entirely. From there, I'll look at some of the major plot points, where the show bends or reshapes events for narrative impact. Finally, I will end by focusing what the series genuinely gets right, because despite its flaws, it does succeed in capturing certain essential truths about the early SAS and the environment in which it was formed. That, and I actually really do enjoy the show. So settle in as we discuss how accurate is season 1 of Rogue Heroes. Now, before we get into the video, 99% of you who watch these videos are not subscribed. Now, if you enjoy this video or my content, then please consider leaving a like on this video and subscribing. It really helps me out and it lets you stay up to date with my channel. So let's look at some of its main characters. David Stirling in the series is portrayed by Connor Swindles, who you may distractingly recognise from Sex Education. He is presented as reckless, openly insubordinate, and frequently bordering on mutiny. The real Stirling was certainly unconventional, but he was also highly intelligent, persuasive, and adept at navigating military bureaucracy when it mattered. He did not succeed by constantly antagonizing his superiors, but by convincing the right people at the right time. Sometimes the show leans too much into Stirling as a disruptive force smashing his way through incompetence. As a whole, I really do enjoy the performance from Swindles and the character of David Stirling. And then we get to arguably one of the most well-known SAS members of all time, Robert Blair Paddy Mayne. Now, Paddy Mayne deserves deeper treatment here, because the gap between the real man and the television portrayal is one of the widest in the series. In the show, Mayne is portrayed by Jack O'Connell, in my opinion a very good actor. The show presents Mayne as a near-permanently enraged figure, barely in control, driven almost entirely by violence and instinct. While he could certainly be aggressive in combat and intimidating when crossed, and there is accounts of him getting into fights, this version strips away much of what made him effective and respected. Mayne was not simply a blunt instrument unleashed by circumstance. He was highly intelligent, well-read, and capable of careful judgment. His reputation for ferocity came largely from moments of extreme stress and combat, not from a constant state of volatility as the show suggests. His background is also significantly altered. In reality, Mayne came from a solidly middle-class Northern Irish family and was educated at Campbell College, before attending Queen's University Belfast, where he studied law. He was also a talented rugby player who represented Ireland at international level. This matters because it explains much about his discipline, leadership, and ability to function within structured environments when he chose to. They also make him lower class and give him grand speeches about
those landowning, gentrified, boy-buggering toffs.
By doing all this, it misses the contrast that defined Mayne. A man who could be charming, articulate, and controlled one moment, and terrifyingly decisive the next. The show's depiction of his attitude to authority is another area where exaggeration distorts reality. His portrayal turns every disagreement into a near-violent confrontation, which undermines the credibility of his later leadership. The training scenes with the French involving Mayne are a good example of where real incidents are inflated for effect. The use of live ammunition during training did occur, particularly to instill realism and stress, but it was controlled and purposeful. The series presents this as reckless endangerment bordering on sadism. In reality, Mayne's approach to training was harsh but deliberate. And finally, one very big inaccuracy is how much Mayne swears. In reality, Mayne did not like swearing. He rarely swore at all. So having him be the character that swears the most in the show is perplexing. And, of course, the accent.
And I had no papers. He gave me a 10-shilling fine for not having identification. They were going to hang me.
The accent is definitely interesting. Speaking to a couple people I know from Northern Ireland, they absolutely hate this accent. Mayne was born in Northern Ireland, so his character having what sounds like a Southern Irish accent is wrong. But as an Englishman, I'm not exactly versed on the differences between the Irish accents. So if you know a bit more, leave a comment down below letting me know. And if you want to learn more about the actual story of Paddy Mayne, I have a video which goes through the story of Paddy Mayne, just as long as you can get over my awful pronunciation of Newtonards. Jock Lewes is handled somewhat more faithfully in my opinion. His intensity and dedication are broadly accurate, but the key aspects of his background are omitted. Nothing is mentioned about his time in Germany or his observations of the Nazi system. He was infatuated with Nazi culture, right up until the night of the long knives. His death is emotionally effective, but questionable in my opinion. The most accurate account suggests that Lewes was covering his patrol's withdrawal, firing at an attacking aircraft from the gun on his jeep. He was then hit by a 20mm round to the leg. I think the death scene we got for him was very good, but the real story shows just how brave and selfless the man was, and I would have preferred to see that instead of him trying to outrun a 109. Eve Mansour is one of the most controversial creative choices. She's not a real person, and instead is a composite character loosely inspired by multiple intelligence operatives in North Africa. Her presence everywhere and her central role in manipulating events, particularly recruitment of the French, is a major distortion. Intelligence networks in North Africa were complex and involved many individuals, not a single omnipresent figure. Her relationship with Stirling feels dramatically convenient and often pulls focus away from the operational reality of how decisions were actually made. For many viewers familiar with the history, her storyline feels unnecessary and over-stylized. It feels she's just there to give David Stirling a love interest. And my God, just wait until we get to season 2. Other characters such as Reg Seekings, Johnny Cooper, Mike Sadler, Pat Riley, Jim Almonds, Dudley Clark and Bill Frazier appear with varying degrees of accuracy. Sadler's extraordinary navigation skills, which were absolutely central to the SAS's success, are underplayed, and so too is the role of the LRDG, or the Long Range Desert Group. All of the incredible men who served in the unit don't even get a mention besides Sadler. I feel it really missed out on something with the LRDG, instead just using them as a taxi service. Pat Riley's leadership and organisational role is minimised in favour of chaos. Dudley Clark is particularly poorly served, portrayed as antagonistic and obstructive, despite being one of the most creative and supportive decision planners in the British Army. The invented feud between Clark and Stirling is especially strange, as historically they were aligned in purpose and I couldn't find any accounts of their bad blood. Several important figures who played key roles in the creation and early success of the SAS are either entirely absent from the show or reduced to fleeting background mentions, which significantly narrows the viewer's understanding of how the unit actually functioned. One of the most notable missions is Lieutenant Colonel John Jock Campbell, commander of the 7th Armoured Division. Campbell was one of the earliest senior officers to take Stirling's ideas seriously, and provided crucial backing at a time where the concept could easily have been dismissed. His willingness to give unconventional units room to experiment created the conditions in which Stirling could operate. Without officers like Campbell, the SAS would never have survived its early failures long enough to prove its value. Another major absence is Major Ralph Bagnold, whose influence on the SAS was indirect but fundamental. As the founder of the LRDG, Bagnold provided not just transportation but an entire operational philosophy for desert warfare. The SAS depended on the LRDG for navigation, insertion, extraction, and logistical support during its most successful early raids. There is also no acknowledgement of the men who paid the price during training and early experimentation. 2 SAS members were killed during a failed parachute training jump before the unit ever entered combat. Their names were Private Joseph Duffy and Private Kenneth Warburton. These deaths had a sobering effect on the unit and influenced how future operations were planned, yet they are completely absent from the series. Omitting these moments contributes to the impression that recklessness had no consequences. Figures involved in intelligence, logistics and plannings are similarly sidelined. Officers within GHQ Middle East and the intelligence services helped protect the SAS politically after early setbacks. People like Bill Frazier, Jim Almonds and Pat Riley are only present as minor characters, despite their contributions to operations and leadership within the unit. Episode 1 is arguably one of the stronger ones in terms of atmosphere and broad accuracy. The sense of frustration with British High Command in North Africa was real, and the opening scene, which is fictionalised, effectively conveys the stagnation and confusion felt at the time. However, the incompetence of command is exaggerated to near parody at points. While there were serious issues, British leadership was not universally oblivious or cowardly. and reducing it to a caricature simplifies the context in which the SAS emerged. As the series progresses episode by episode, the raids become increasingly stylized. Many real operations are omitted entirely, while others are merged or rewritten for dramatic clarity. Explosions, gunfights, and improvisation are turned up to create momentum. But the careful planning, intelligence gathering, and logistical support behind these raids is often absent. The SAS begin to feel too ad hoc, almost improvising everything on the fly, when in reality even their most daring operations were underpinned by meticulous preparation. And of course, I get a lot of these inaccuracies. The show wants to be entertaining, and it also has to have a tight narrative. So cutting some of these characters out, reducing characters into minor roles, completely omitting events, is necessary to fit the series into 6 episodes, and stuff like intelligence gathering and logistics work aren't exactly the most exciting. And if things were told correctly, a lot of these events would be more boring. The show needs to up the ante and dial all their characters to 20. The characters need to become stereotypes in order to be distinguishable from each other. But some of that to me feels wrong, and at the end of the day, I'm just here to point out the inaccuracies and tell you the history. One thing I have seen people complain about is the soundtrack, and the soundtrack plays a significant role in shaping perception. The use of modern rock music reinforces the idea of the SAS as rebellious rock stars of warfare. For some of the viewers, this works. As a massive fan of rock music, I love the inclusion of it. And I do enjoy the fact that it mixes in contemporary music, but I can get where some people are coming from. Despite its heightened tone and deliberate stylization, SAS Rogue Heroes does get a number of important things right about the early SAS, particularly in capturing the spirit of the unit and the context in which it was formed. The series succeeds in showing just how frustrated many junior officers and men were with the rigid thinking of the British High Command in North Africa in 1941. The sense that conventional methods were failing, that lives were being wasted for little gain, and that the Desert War demanded new ideas is accurate. Stirling's core concept of striking Axis air power at its source rather than meeting it head-on was genuinely radical at the time, and the show correctly presents the SAS as an experiment born out of desperation rather than careful long-term planning. The sometimes ad hoc nature of the early unit, its uncertain status, and the fact that it survived only because a few senior officers were willing to take a risk are all portrayed effectively. The series also does a good job of showing how small numbers could have an outsized impact when used intelligently. While individual raids are exaggerated, the overall effect of SAS operations on Axis airfields is not. The destruction of aircraft on the ground really did force the Germans and Italians to change how they dispersed, guarded, and operated their air power. The reliance on surprise, mobility, and night operations is well conveyed, as is the dependence on the LRDG for navigation and transport during the SAS's early successes. It's here I want to talk about one of the worst scenes from the show, and one of the weirdest inaccuracies. It's the scene of David Stirling's capture. The combat to me in this scene is really janky. I mean, the Germans can't seem to hit anything, and Cooper and Sadler managed to get away, which is actually historically accurate, but it is so, again, just janky. The inaccuracy I want to point out in this scene is this monstrosity. This immediately took me out of the TV show, because this is supposed to be a German tank. This is not a German tank, this is an M60 Patton, a US tank that was made almost 20 years after this scene takes place. You might see in older war movies that Pattons are used in place of other German tanks or, Allied or British tanks. I get why they were used in the older war movies, but in 2021, using a Patton in place of a German tank, it looks so horrendous. It takes you out the scene completely if you know anything about tanks. I mean, it looks so modern anyways, so even if you didn't know much about tanks, it would take you out the scene. Finally, the show is effective in conveying the physical and psychological strain of desert warfare. The heat, exhaustion, boredom, punctuated by moments of extreme violence and a sense of isolation far from support all ring true. The visual emphasis on long drives, endless sand, and the vulnerability of men and vehicles in such an environment reflects the real reality faced by units like the SAS and the LRDG. The show does give viewers a decent idea of the timeline of the SAS in North Africa as well, with practically all of its events and raids actually happening. And I think it's a good gateway for people to get into the history of the SAS. It gives recognition to the incredible men of the SAS. It's an extremely good TV show and it's captivating. and it might lead people to research the actual history behind the show, which I think is very important. Overall, Season 1 of SAS Rogue Heroes is broadly accurate in outline, but can be highly unreliable in its detail. It captures the spirit of experimentation, defiance, and the frustration that gave birth to the SAS, but it reshapes personalities, invents conflicts between people, and amplifies aggression to an almost cartoonish level. It is effective television and is emotionally engaging, but it should be treated as a dramatic interpretation rather than a faithful account. If you go into it with that mindset, you're going to have a very good time. Please don't take it as a history lesson. And if you are interested in the SAS, there are so many fantastic books and videos, such as my series, The Rogue Heroes, which give you a great understanding of the history, with many, many more on their way. So give them a watch and stay tuned for more. And if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, subscribe and turn that bell notification on, share this video with your friends, and most importantly, let me know any inaccuracies that I missed. And if you have any other video ideas or people or things you would like me to talk about next. Because sometimes history doesn't need a rewrite. It just needs to be told properly.